This is Peter Sullivan, Adult Services Librarian at the Mayor Riley Stiles Public Library. Today is Wednesday, October 19th, 2022, and I will be interviewing former Falls Church resident K. Martin Britto. This interview is taking place at Meridian High School in Falls Church, Virginia, and is part of the Mayor Riley Stiles Public Library Oral History Project. Hello, Ms. Britto. How are you today?
Good, Peter. Happy to be here.
So I was wondering if you could talk about your early life in Falls Church. Where did you live in the city, and what was your neighborhood like?
Okay, I'll be happy to. I'm proud of being a former Falls Church resident. I lived there I was born in Georgetown Hospital in 1936 and lived in Falls Church until 1958 when I got married. And I lived at 806 Lincoln Avenue, which was at the corner, is still at the corner of Lincoln Avenue and Oak Street. And when I lived there, the property was 3/4 of an acre, and our house was on one corner. It was a triangular lot, and we were at the wide part of the triangle. And since my mother sold the house, I think it was in 1963, one of the owners portioned off the property and built houses, I think one on Lincoln and maybe two on Oak Street. And I was asked about the neighborhood. We lived across the street from us at the corner of Lincoln and Oak, kind of cat-a-corner from us, was a family, and they had a cow and hens, and I think maybe pigs also. And so if we needed milk or eggs, we would just run across the street and get some. But the thing was that milk was not pasteurized or homogenized. And when it was spring and the cows ate onions, green onions out in the yard, it had a bad taste. And so I complained about this, and the rest of my siblings were like, oh, you're just picky, it's not that bad, because they had grown up with it their whole lives. And then, so my oldest brother said, well, I'm going to give you a test. I'm going to put a glass of store milk on the table, and next to it a glass of Schaefer's milk. And so you taste them and tell me which one. Well, I had a 50% chance of being right, but anyhow, I very well knew the difference. And you were asking about other people who lived in our neighborhood. Across the street from us, directly across Lincoln Avenue, was an empty lot when I was a child. But I think it was around 1946 that a house was built on that lot. And the names of the family in our neighborhood were, next door to us were the McMillans, excuse me, across the street, the Harrisons and the Eatons, and then on the Oak Street side were the Phillips. And also on that side, there was an interesting thing. There were 3 medium-size, for Falls Church, ordinary kind of houses in a row, and they were pretty much all alike, and I think they were built at the same time. They were, at least as long as I lived in that part of Falls Church, Mormon families owned them. And they would sell them, if one moved, they would sell it to another Mormon family. So that was just, we knew those 3 Mormon families, and I don't know if they're still there today, but in the 40s, that's who lived there. And it was funny, one of the sons, Falls Church, had or Fairfax County at that time, had a ruling that you had to be 6, I think, when you started school. And one of those children, a boy, was like 6 at the end of September. So his parents didn't want him to miss a whole year of school. St. James didn't have any requirement about age. So he may be one of the only Mormon children in the world who went to a Catholic school. But he went to St. James just for first grade. Then he could transfer into the public school system after that. My house was built in 1926. My parents had it built, and it was, from what I heard about it, the mortgage was $12,000. I don't know what they put down or how, but that was the mortgage for the house and the lot. And the house was a Sears house. And from what I've read about it, you had to live near a railroad track to get a Sears house, because all the parts were shipped on a train. And so we lived across the street from the Washington and Old Dominion, so it was easy to get the stuff moved over. And it was like I don't know how long they continued building those Sears houses, but they're in other parts of the country. And when I see some, I say, oh, you'll see, ours was the only one in our neighborhood, but sometimes you'll see a stretch of them built somewhere near a railroad track. And that was the Washington and Old Dominion line, but we called it, well, when I was a child, I called it the Old Minion, and I liked to see it. So if we were eating dinner or whatever we were doing and we heard the train, somebody would pick me up and take me to the window or to the front porch so I could see the train go by. But I never rode it much. By the time I was going places on my own, like in the late 40s, 50s, it was more of a freight train thing. Mm-hmm. But my siblings rode it sometime, mm-hmm. and my father, I think, used to ride it to work. There were different things. I'm sure you've got a history of that. But there was something like, it wasn't called rollator, but it was some peculiar word that it could, I think it went on tracks, and then when it got to D.C., it would put down wheels, and it could go in the city. But we used mostly the Arnold bus lines, and the one that we used almost always was the one that was called 3F. And it left D.C., and it ended at Weston Broad in Falls Church. And so everywhere we went, and especially during the war, when people didn't have gas, more people rode the bus. And let's see, well, some of the other names. And I'm not sure about this, but when I was quite young, it seems like Lincoln Avenue was a dirt road. And in the summer, they used to put down, some summers they put down something that was like a salt solution. It was white and like crumbly, and that was to keep the dust down. But we went barefoot all the time in the summer, so this stuff would get on our feet, and when we came in the house, my mother would get upset. And also, at some points, they put tar down to keep, and that would get stick to your feet. And let's see, a fire was a big event in my family, so that if you heard the fire siren go off, and it didn't go off all that often, but we would run outside, didn't matter what time of day, and try to figure out what direction it was going in. And then we would say, well, it must be going out Broad Street, or it must be going this way or that way. And one of my memories of that was that when I was a child, I don't remember how old, there was a very big fire over near National Memorial Park, and we got in the car and ran out there to see that. Did you want me to talk about my parents and siblings at this point?
Please, that would be great.
Okay. My parents were J.O. Martin, who was born and raised in New Jersey and then moved to Baltimore, where he met my mother. My mother was French from Normandy, and she came to Canada when she was 14, joined her mother and brothers there, and then her mother moved to Baltimore, and my mother went with her. And so that's where my parents met. They lived in Baltimore. I think they had about 5 children in Baltimore. And then they moved to Falls Church, and they first lived over on Washington Street. And I don't know the name of the cross street, but there are 2 churches. Columbia Street, maybe it is. They're across from each other. They lived in a house there. Later, they lived on Park Avenue near St. James, and then they moved in 26 into the house on Lincoln Avenue. Let's see, what else I've got here? Oh, and then my siblings. I was the youngest of 8, so my oldest brother was Jimmy, and he was born in 1915. He worked for the telephone company, as my father did. And then next in line was my brother Paul, who was kind of, I've been told, was a hippie before his time. He drove a cab, and he used to follow the horse races up from Florida up the East Coast, to bet. And he, when he went in the service, he didn't really have any set job. And he went first he was in the 29th Division of infantry that was composed of people from Virginia and Maryland. And it was, a lot of the men in it were from the National Guard over like near Waynesboro and that area of Virginia. So some of them were draftees, but the core group was this National Guard group. And he was a big storyteller, and so he used to talk about how one day, this was, at the end of the Depression, this was like 42 maybe, and a lot of these men came from rural, kind of poor areas, and he said when they would be having food, like in a cafeteria, they would say, "Wow, this is good food," and he was like raising his eyebrows like, "No, I don't think it is," but I think some of them might have been happy to have enough food, kind of thing. And let's see, that's Paul. Then was my next brother, whose name his original name was Henry, Henri, because my mother was French, and so she named some of the children with French names. But later, when he grew up, he decided he didn't like that, so he kept his first name, but his middle name he took as Christopher, and so from that point on, he became Chris. And he was in the service in North Africa at an air base, and they were in charge of planes. As I understood it, they flew from the U.S. and maybe down to South America, I'm not sure, and then across and up to Africa. And the reason for this was so they wouldn't be shot at crossing the Atlantic up near, like going to England or something like that. And so that's where he stayed for the whole war. But it was a desert, and it was kind of rough. He used to tell this story that a general or somebody high up came to inspect the base, and he got there, and he was getting off the plane, and he said, "No, I'm not getting out. It's too hot." So he got back on and took off, and my brother was like a lieutenant, and he was in charge of this whole place. When I was growing up, there were 3 parts of Falls Church. And I don't know, do you want me to talk about the East End, which was not really Falls Church?
Sure, you could talk about that. Do you want to say anything about the rest of your siblings?
Oh, thank you for keeping me on
Sure.
track. I'm looking at my notes. That was only the 3rd. The 4th was my sister Jeanette, and she was the only girl in the middle of 6 boys, 3 brothers, older and 3 younger. And she went to Mary Washington College and became a teacher. And then later, in 44, she married a man from New Jersey that she had known before the war, and they got married in Florida. And we went on the train to the wedding in June of 44, and she ended up living in New Jersey. Okay, let's get to the next one, is Jack, and we called him like it was pronounced J-A-C-K, but it was really spelled J-A-C-Q-U-E-S. It was Jacques. That was another French name in the family. And he went to a school called Bliss Electrical, which was in D.C., and I think he maybe only went for 1 year, because I think he went in the Navy when he was like 19 or something like that. But it was, as I understood it, a school which was like the beginning of tech, of computers, and I think that he was trained in, and I don't know this for a fact, but I think he was trained in radar. It might have just been the beginning of it. And he was going to be sent to Iceland for a station there, but his ship was, in February of 43, was sunk, and he died at sea. And then next was my brother Joe, who was another colorful member of our family, kind of wild and crazy. And all of my siblings, all 7 of them, went to high school in D.C. because the Fairfax schools were not considered that good. And so they would take the streetcar, or maybe later the younger ones took buses, but they went to different high schools in D.C. They went to, I think one was called McKinley Tech, another was called Central, and then the younger brothers went to what was called Western, which was in Georgetown. And so he enlisted, I think, or maybe he was drafted, but at 18, and he hadn't even finished high school. He was like a senior in high school. So he went in the infantry and had a very, very rough time. He was a medic at one point, and was an article about him that he went into a minefield to tend to the wounded and carry some of them out. You know, it was a very brave thing to do, but I think also he was kind of young. You know, his brain hadn't fully developed, so he was just, you know, oh, I'll go get those guys, you know. So, but anyhow, and then he ended up going to Washington and Lee University and worked in journalism and public relations, that type of thing. And then the one closest to me was my brother John, and he went to Western High School, and also, well, when he got out of high school in 1945, the war was not quite over, so he was drafted and went in the Army and served, but the war, you know, then it ended in August, so he didn't see any combat. But he did have to stay in for 2 years. And then, but the good thing about that is if you were in the Army, you got the GI Bill. So by being in for those 2 years, he got his college paid for. And he went to Washington Lee also. And then he went to George Washington University for med school and did practice in the Falls Church in Fairfax area for a long time. He had an office at Broad and Oak. There was a maybe 2 or 3 story office building there, but he was known pretty well. My mother used to say that when my father was younger, he was well known around Falls Church. He worked in the community theater and he was on library board, different things. And so people would say, oh, you're J.O. Martin's wife. And she said then later, when my brother was practicing, they'd say, oh, you're Dr. Martin's mother. So she said she never got her own recognition. It was through these others. And then there's me. I was the youngest. I was born 9 years after my closest brother. My father was 51 and my mother was 42. And I was born into this big family, but I never got to grow up with that family because I think when I was 6, World War II started, and our family was never together again as a family because the 2 of them being killed and the others went off to school, got married, you know. So I was pretty much raised as an only child. I had nieces and nephews who were closer in age to me than my brothers because I have a niece who's 5 years younger than I am. And let's see. That's the siblings, okay? And then I thought I would talk. Well, did you have another question for me?
Sure. Well, could we hear a little bit more about your parents? You said your father worked for the telephone company,
right.
but he was also fairly active in the community,
yes,
and
he was
a writer as well.
Yes, he was a writer. And, well, our family had, one time, there was a time when 3 of my brothers had something published, you know, not big time, but I can't remember what Johnny's was about, but my brother Chris lived in retirement in Rapidan, Virginia, which is kind of near Charlottesville, and he had a vineyard, and so it was one of the first vineyards in that area, and so he had written something for a wine magazine, and then I think my brother Joe had written something else, but we were kind of a family of writers, and on down into the next generations. But he did write a couple of books, and I'm wondering if you have one at the Falls Church Library. It was called C&P Country, and it was what we'd call a travelogue, or history and geography all combined, and it was composed of articles that he had written. He was the editor of the C&P magazine, employee magazine. You know, most of it was like who retired, who got married, you know, that kind of personal stuff. But he would also write articles, like you'd call a feature, that would be like something about Fredericksburg, or, you know, somewhere in Maryland or West Virginia that was famous or historical significance. So, and he wrote pretty much all his life, and he was big on public speaking too, and so he taught some classes in public speaking. And let's see, he died in 1963 in Falls Church. After they left Lincoln Avenue, my parents lived, and I don't know if they're still there, there were some apartments off of West Street. Behind, there was a gas station at the corner of West and Broad, and there was a small development there, and that's where he died. And my mother lived there, and then later they lived in Tyler Gardens too, yeah. After they left 806, they moved to Tyler Gardens. Then they went to Florida. They used to go to Florida sometime in the winter. And and when they came back, they went into this Ellison Street one. Then my mother lived later in a building that I don't know if it's still there. It was on Broad Street, directly across from St. James School, in between Spring and Oak. And it was a rather large apartment building. She lived there for a while, and then they built a new building kind of down behind the Falls Church, an apartment complex. And I think it was Fairfax Street, I think was the street that the building was on. And she lived there, and she died in 1977 when she lived there. So is that enough?
Sure. Well,
Okay.
I was just going to ask, you know, your mother must have been very busy with
Yes,
8
the
children,
family,
but
yeah.
did she have any time to get involved in the community at all?
Oh, yes, she was involved in the community. Some of the letters that I have from World War II, my father mentions Mother is out with the Red Cross, and she was very involved in the school, you know, not teaching or anything official, but just helping with different things with the school. And I'm trying to think, by the time when I was a small child and when I was in high school, it was during World War II, so there was just a lot going on. And then when I was older, she would help take care of some of these grandchildren, because the first one was born like in 42, and there were a lot of them, you know, like I think she had something like 22 grandchildren. So, and then she would travel some. We would go see my sister in New Jersey, and then in the winter she would go with my father to Florida. But she was mainly busy in the house. At one point, my aunt, her sister, and her 4 children lived with my parents. So my mother had in the house 11 children under 13. And she said, she used to tell me how much they would eat, that they had a bread man, and she said he would line up the loaves of bread like that and bring them in, and she'd go through a loaf at a meal. And then, of course, we could get the milk across the street. So she was always busy. She really was.
I believe it.
And let's see. Okay, that enough about my parents and
Sure.
siblings.
Well, I was just going to follow up. You've already spoken about how World War II affected
Right.
your family, and you've also very generously donated some of the letters between family members during the war. But could you speak a little bit more about that, and your memories of wartime?
Okay, sure. I have a lot of them because it was such a, I don't know the right word, but like catastrophic time for our family. I mean, not just our family, but the whole Falls Church was just so much going on in World War II because it grew a lot. And the people were just makeshift housing, like, you know, to try to. I think the Pentagon was built, I don't know when, but I think maybe the early 40s or somewhere in there. So people came to work in the Pentagon. There were temporary office buildings along the mall in D.C. because all of a sudden they needed all these workers, you know, and military and government. And so it was just a time of huge growth. And I can remember the things like that there was a blackout at night. And I think one of my brothers, before he went in the Army, he was like, I can't remember what they called them, captains or something, that went around, patrolled the neighborhood. And if they could see any light, they would knock on your door and say, you've got to block that out. And I can remember I had a radio that had a light, you know, just for the radio. And I put it on the floor, and I used to try to read next to that light of the radio because you couldn't have any lights on once it got dark, you know, and in the winter. And then, oh, I know one of the funny things that happened with rationing. Shoes were rationed. And so they made these kind of cardboard shoes. I mean, they were really flimsy. And so I was going to be in a wedding, and my cousin's wedding when I was about 8 or 9, and I had to have white shoes for this wedding. So we went into D.C. In those days, everything was in D.C. There was no Tyson's, no Seven Corners. You just got on the bus and went in town. And we went to a shoe store, and they had shoes, and they were like in a big bin, these cheap, you didn't have to have a coupon for the cardboard ones. You could, you know, because my mother didn't want to use my coupons for these white shoes that I wouldn't wear very much. So she wanted to save them for sturdy shoes, you know, that I would wear to school. So we went in the bin, and we picked up the shoes, and we got whatever size I wore, 2 of them. And then when it was time for the wedding, they were like 2 left feet. So I had to wear these cardboard shoes with no right foot. But, and it was just rationing. We had, I mean, I think a lot of people have heard about margarine that came with a little capsule, and it either came with a capsule or with some powder. And the powder was kind of orange, and you were supposed to put your margarine in a bowl and then sprinkle this powder over and then stir and stir and stir until you could get it to be yellow. But often, if it was my job, I would get fed up with this and just leave orange streaks. I didn't care whether it was. And then the other thing was the margarine came in a plastic pouch like that. And the little capsule was inside the pouch. So my memory of it was you had to press down on this capsule and break it so it would go into the white margarine, and then you had to squeeze this plastic package for a long time until it blended in with the little capsule of orange that was in there. And I had been told that the reason that they couldn't make margarine yellow, which they could have done, was that the butter industry didn't want this competition, you know, of people thinking that it was okay to use margarine instead of butter, even though during the war you couldn't get butter, so you used it. And sugar was rationed. Oh, and then there was, this is kind of silly, but they had a thing where you saved your grease. Like if you cooked bacon, you had a can, like a Crisco, we used Crisco then, but a can, and you would pour that melted grease from the bacon or whatever it was you were cooking, pork chops or whatever, it just all went in this can. And then you took it to the butcher shop, this can full of yucky, you know, old grease, and they would give you some meat coupons for that because they needed that fat for something. I mean, I don't think they were going to cook with it. I think it was for munitions or something that they wanted fat. And the other thing they wanted was tin foil. Like your gum came in, you saved it and you wrapped it up until you got a nice big ball, and then I don't know what you did with it then, but that was something. But the joke was that my father, who was a very reserved person, but he had this one joke that a butcher shop said, "Ladies, please do not bring your fat cans into the butcher shop on Saturday," because they were busy on Saturday and they didn't want all these people with their cans of fat blocking the aisle, kind of thing. So that was it. And I can't remember what other things we saved, but I know that was the tin foil and the grease. And then canned goods were somewhat hard to get. Like pineapple was a very rare treat. And we would get it, and it would be the rings, like Dole pineapple. And my mother would serve it out, and I would look at my father's and say, "I really do like pineapple. I haven't had any in a long time." And finally he'd say, "Take mine," because I was a rather bratty child, being the youngest and not having siblings, around much. But was there anything else in the World War II that you can think of? We had coupon books, and there were little like stamps that you tore out. And I don't remember what else besides food. And my husband lived in New England, and somebody in his family worked for a dairy, so he said they had butter all during the war, but we didn't. I can remember butter and sugar and some of the canned goods, but that's, and clothes. I don't remember what else besides shoes, but I remember you had coupons for shoes. And so we just made do, I don't remember it being a hardship as the way in food. My mother was a good cook, and so it didn't bother me that much except for the pineapple. And maybe for some candy or cookies, things that were with sugar. But it was an interesting time to live. And one last thing, when you're talking about Falls Church, my mother had a friend whose husband worked at the Canadian Embassy, and in those days, during the war, you could not get a washing machine. They just weren't being made, an automatic washing machine. And my mother had one. So this lady who lived a few blocks from us would carry all her dirty clothes to our house and go down in our basement and wash, several loads of clothes, and then carry them out and take them home. I mean, people just made do. And there was more, like with the Vietnam War, there was much more animosity, but in World War II it was more like everybody was helping everybody else and being sympathetic, that kind of thing. Is it okay to start talking about St. James?
Sure.
Now, I went to St. James Elementary School, which at that time went from 1st through 8th grade, and I went for the whole 8 years. And so during the war years, I think I started there in 41, 42, somewhere around there. And so the whole time of the war, up until 45 and even after the war was over, the school was very crowded. When I started, it was a brick school that had 2 floors and about 4 or 6 classrooms. And I think it was built in the 1800s, late 1800s. And it was taught by nuns then, and I don't think we had any lay teachers. They were all nuns who taught there. And I went there in 1st grade, and then when I went in 2nd grade, the war was in full swing. And so there were just enormous amount of children. And my 2nd grade class had 100 children in it with 1 nun. And the room was so small. I think they'd taken 2 rooms and combined them into 1, but there weren't enough desks for this group of 100 children. So the way it worked was that if you were absent, they took your books out of your desk and put them on a windowsill. And when you came back, you had to sit on that windowsill. They were wide windowsills because it was an old school, and do your work there until somebody else was absent and you got to take over their desk. So if my mother would say to me, "Oh, I think you're getting a cold, maybe you better stay home today," I'd say, "No, I don't want to lose my desk. I've got to go." So that was 2nd grade. And then I don't remember where I had third, but by the time I was in fourth grade, which would have been about 1944, they built a wing they kept the old building there, the old brick building, and then they built a modern wing just by itself, like it wasn't connected. It was just, and it went the length of the parking lot. The old school was like here, and then the new building wing was here. And then I came back into the old building for 6th and 7th grade, and while I was in 7th grade, they started building the building, which was the new building. And so while we were in school, they were putting up walls around us. They kept the old building here and then started, and we got out of school early that year because the plan was to tear down the old school and build this new building immediately over the summer so that it would be ready for fall. And so we got out, like, I guess sometime in May maybe, but it seems like we had to go like on Saturday or stay later or something to try to make up the hours. And trying to think what other things about St. James. Well, we had, for graduation, when I finished 8th grade, we had a very fancy graduation. The girls all wore long dresses in pastel colors, and we had big hats, like picture hats that in the color that matched our dress. And then, let me see, I want to go back to when I was younger. Well, one thing that was funny, we didn't have a car, and so getting groceries was kind of an issue, especially for a big family. So we got the eggs and the milk from the man across the street. I don't know whether we ever got pigs, whether we got any pork, but I know those two things we got. And then there was a man that came around in a truck, or a small truck, and he was called the Jewel Tea Man. And this company's main product was tea, but they also sold coffee, and I think they sold like spices, like vanilla or cinnamon and things like that. So he had a route, sort of like a milkman would have, but it was like once a month maybe or something. And he would pull up, and then I don't know whether I guess my mother walked out to the van or the little truck and chose what she wanted, and then she bought it. And then there was another man called Mr. Sloper, and he had like a refitted school bus, but a very old one, because we're talking about the 1940s, early 40s, and he sold vegetables and fruit. And so I guess he came more often. I don't know if he came every week or what, but he would do the same thing. He'd park out in front of our house, and my mother would go out and buy all the different vegetables and things. So that's the way. There was no pickup or no delivery, other than that. And my mother did a lot of cooking. She didn't buy frozen foods. I can remember when frozen orange juice came out, and this was a really big deal because before you had to squeeze every orange that you had for orange juice. So frozen and other frozen vegetables, I guess, when I was maybe a teen, came out. And let me just check my notes. Okay. Is it okay if I just go to my memories of Falls Church?
Sure. Can I ask you one more thing about
sure.
St. James? One of the items in the materials that you've donated to the library is a newspaper clipping, and it shows you...
Oh, yes. I know which one you're going to say.
Oh, please go ahead.
Yeah, that connects both St. James and World War II. When I was probably 7, I was fairly young. It was one of my brothers had already been killed, so it was 43 maybe, or early 44. My second brother died in August of 44, so it was sometime between February of 43 and August of 44. So I think I was in second. And during the war, they had this thing, and we had it at St. James, where you would bring in money and you would buy savings stamps. And they looked, like a regular stamp, and it might cost a quarter, I don't remember, or it could be a dime. And then you had a book, and you stuck these stamps in the book until you got to, was like around $18. And when you had sold, bought that many stamps and had a full book, then you would turn it in and you would get a savings bond. So we were encouraged to use like our allowance or our spare money to buy bonds. And so at some point, St. James, because there were 8 grades, so there were pretty many kids, had enough money, what they had bought in war stamps, war bonds, to purchase a Jeep. So somebody in the Army or public relations decided this would be a good morale booster or something. So they drove the Jeep to the parking lot, the playground at St. James, and because I had lost a brother in the war, I was chosen to be the one to present, like it wasn't real, but like a check to the Jeep, to the Army officer that was there. So there was a picture, I don't know whether it was the Post or the Star, but it was one of those daily papers, and it shows me, I think I'm standing on the bumper of the Jeep, and I'm handing over this thing, and all the kids from the school are standing around. So it says, St. James School Children Buy a Jeep.
And so you went to St. James for elementary school. Where did you go to high school, and how did you get there?
Okay, that's pretty funny. The high schools in Virginia were not that good. I think I mentioned that earlier. So no one in my family went to St. James, and then they went into D.C. because my father worked there. If your father worked there, you could go for free. So by the time I went, it was 9 years after the last sibling had been, and my brother very much wanted me to go to Western High School, which was in Georgetown. And so we looked into it, and at that point, you had to pay $200 tuition if you didn't live in D.C. It didn't matter if your father worked there or not. You had to pay tuition if you came from another area. So we looked into it, and there was a high school, a Catholic girls' high school out at Tenley Circle, out Wisconsin Avenue. And there was no O'Connell High School then. So if you wanted to go to a Catholic high school, anybody that lived in Falls Church, Arlington, that area, you went into D.C. to go to a Catholic high school, boys and girls. And so some went to Trinity, which was in Georgetown. There was one called Notre Dame that was on Capitol Street. And the boys went to mainly Gonzaga and St. John's were the two big Catholic boys' schools. So it wasn't unusual for people out in Virginia to go into D.C. to go to a Catholic school. So I went there from 1950 to 1954, and I would get the bus on Broad Street near either Spring Street or Oak Street, and I took that into Roslyn, and I paid 5 cents for that ride because the transportation, the Arnold bus lines had an agreement that, and I don't know whether it was with the county or the state or something, but that students could ride their buses for 5 cents. So like kids that came to St. James that came from Vienna or Arlington, they would ride the bus, to get to St. James. So it was a common thing that people paid 5 cents. But when you got to Roslyn, you had to get off because this agreement was for only Virginia students. If you were not going to a school in Virginia, you had to pay the regular price. So it was a common thing for all these high school students that went to Catholic schools in D.C., and some of them may have been going to other private schools, I don't know. But you got off in Roslyn, and then you walked across the street, and there was a circle called Roslyn Circle, and the streetcar was there. It was like a turnaround spot for the streetcar. So you got off, and you went over there, and you got on the streetcar, and with all these other kids, these were my friends, that boys and girls that were going to other schools. And for 3 cents, you could ride the streetcar. So we would get on it there and get a transfer, and you didn't put the money in the box. You had a little book about that big of little coupons, like little tear-off things, and you'd drop that in the box. But with that transfer, we were able to get on another streetcar, which was at the base of Wisconsin Avenue in Georgetown, and take that out Wisconsin Avenue to Tenley Circle, where our school was. And there were 7 of us in my class who came from Virginia, and different parts, some from Arlington and some from Falls Church. And you did the same thing in reverse in the afternoon. You rode from down Wisconsin Avenue, got on one streetcar, took it to Roslyn, and then the bus pulled up. It came over Key Bridge, and there was a bus stop right at the end of the bridge. And so we got off the trolley car and walked over there and got on the bus and went home.
And was it during these years in high school that you started working at the library?
Yes, it was. I think it was after my first year of high school in 1951, maybe. I don't know whether it was, no, I think it was 51, because I was 14, and then I turned 15 that fall. But I worked that summer after my freshman year in high school, and at that time the library was in a big white frame house at the corner of West Broad and West Street. And it was on the corner where there's now a huge shopping complex, or whatever it's called. But anyhow, that's where I worked, and I worked there in the summer, not very long hours, like maybe 3 hours at a time, but I would work on Saturdays, generally all day Saturday. And then in the winter, I worked, I think it was Monday night they had me, because in libraries that's usually one of the busiest nights of the week. So I was what was called a page or a shelver, but as I worked there a while, and as I got older, they got to know me better and let me do more things rather than just shelve the books. And I worked there all through high school during the week and the summers, and then I went away to college. In '54, I went to Mary Washington in Fredericksburg, and at that time it was called Mary Washington College of the University of Virginia, and that's what my diploma says. So I like to tease my kids and say, I graduated from UVA, but I didn't really. And so I worked there one Christmas, I guess in my freshman year, and it was a Monday night, and all the adult librarians decided that this was a good night for them to be home and not working because it was the Christmas holidays. And my memory of it is that I was the only one there, but there might have been one other person. But it was fantastically busy, and I couldn't check the books in. I piled them up behind the desk, so when they came in the next day, there was this huge area of books piled in, and I just couldn't check the people out fast enough. It was just crazy. So after that, my mother said, I don't think you should work in the library anymore. So I didn't. I had other summer jobs until later when I was an adult. Let's see what else I've got here.
And could you talk a little bit more about just what Falls Church looked like and what the different parts of the city were
yeah, that's
at
one
that
of the
time
things
in the
I've got
40s
right
and
here
50s?
on my notes. We called it, we had 3 different areas, and everybody who had lived there for any length of time knew what you were talking about. So the West End, which was called West Falls Church, but not everybody called it that, but in our house we called it, I'm going to the West End. And there was a really rickety old store across West Street from the library, and it seems like it had wooden floors. I mean, it was really old in the 40s, and we would go there sometime to get like ice cream or a drink or something. And I can remember, I think it was the first time there I saw frozen Milky Ways. They had a freezer for their ice cream, so they kept the Milky Ways in there, and that was a big deal to get those Milky Ways. And let's see what else was up there. Grocery store. there was a Tasty Freeze on Broad Street in that block between West and Spring. It was on the other side of the road from the school, from Villa Maria and from where the library was. It was kind of in the middle of the block. And I used to go there a lot. And the other areas, well, was where that new complex is built. There was a farm there that had animals out in the back. That was the West End. And then the main part of town we called the Village. And in there was, I think it was Ware's, W-A-R-E, drugstore was on the corner. And there was Robinson's 5 and 10, which was in that complex. And there was Brown's Hardware. Whenever I talk to anybody about being from Falls Church, they always say, oh, you knew Brown's Hardware. And then the bank was on another corner. And I can't remember what was on that. It might have been a gas station. I'm not sure what was on the fourth corner. And then the State Theater is where it still is, up the block from the main crossroads there. And we went to the State Theater all the time when I was growing up because it was air conditioned. And nobody had air conditioning. When it was very hot, you slept out in the yard or you had the windows open. You know, it was miserable. But the buses at some point had air conditioning, and the State Theater had air conditioning. So we would go, it cost 20 cents for a ticket, and candy bar would be a nickel, and we would go and just stay for a long time. Like the way the movies were done then, it wasn't like now where they have it ends and everybody leaves and then a new group comes in. You paid your ticket and you could stay as long as you wanted. So you could also go in the middle of a movie and just sit there, and then it would come around again and you'd see the other half, you know, the first half. And they had the newsreels and the coming attractions and cartoons, I think it seems. I mean, this was before TV. This was before phones or video games or anything. So our entertainment was very simple. And we did a lot of imaginative play, imaginary play, because there wasn't much else to do. I mean, it was a small town and there wasn't much going on. So we would go to the State Theater and we would watch a movie or maybe two, you know, watch it twice. And then they had, where their bathrooms were, they had like a lounge with chairs kind of like this, kind of fancy. And that was like the ladies' lounge or something. And I don't know what they expected you to do while you were there, but we played there. We would have imaginary games that play, you know, and so, because we wanted to stay inside as long as we could, you know, on a hot day. And we also had imaginary play just around our house and around our yards, and we would go in the woods. And I can remember one time, like, we were pretending that we had houses, and so we would like draw a line in the dirt or in the branches, whatever was there, and this would be my house and your house, and then we would go back and forth, and there'd be a road. And the other thing we did a lot of, which sounds really weird today, but we played on the railroad tracks, because the trains did not go by very often in those days. I think they were mainly in the 40s commuter trains, or there was maybe some freight trains too, but we weren't worried, and our parents evidently weren't worried that we were on these train tracks all the time. But I can remember that the rails would get really hot in the summer because they were metal in the sun, and so we used to try to walk on them like balancing, but in the summer you didn't do that. And there was a place down in East Falls Church, and I don't know how the trail goes now, but there was a bridge at that time, a little bridge that the train went over, and under that was a creek, and we used to walk down there and play in that creek in the hot weather because there weren't any community pools, you know. I mean, there was not a whole lot to do in the summer. But we read, went to the library, got books, and and at night, I had the biggest yard around, so we would play these games like between dinner and bedtime. And my house had a sidewalk, and so we'd play these games where you were on either side of the sidewalk, and one was called Red Rover Come Over, and then there was another one called Mother May I. Have you ever heard of that?
I've heard the names, but I...
Okay, this is the way it worked. You would be on two sides. I mean, I may not have all this right because it's been many years, but you would say, the first person, the leader, like, would say, pick up your right arm. So you would go like that. But you had to say, Mother May I. And if you just picked up your right arm without saying Mother May I, then you were out. And it would go on like that. Or you'd say, take one step to the right, or scratch your head, just different. But you had to be alert, because if you just did it, like scratch your head and you didn't say Mother May I, you were out. And then there was another one called something about something, what's your trade? Lemonade, lemonade, what's your trade? And you would do something, like if you were like this, you might be driving a bus, or you might be hammering something, but you would pantomime it like charades. And then there would be one person doing that, and the other group, all the others, and there might be 10 of us out there, would say, oh, you're a carpenter, or else they would just keep guessing and they couldn't figure out what you were. But that's what you did in summer evenings when I was a child. And then sometime my mother would come out with a pitcher of lemonade, or Kool-Aid was really big in those days. And so that was what you did in the evening. And for a really big treat, and it only happened like maybe once a summer, you would go to Glen Echo, and it had a nice big pool. So that was your chance to get to a swimming pool like once a summer. And you had to take the bus into Georgetown, and then you took a streetcar from Georgetown out to Glen Echo and went to the pool, and and rode the roller coaster. And that was big excitement. And even when I was a teenager, it was open, and we would go on the rides and things.
Was there any film in particular you remember?
Oh, let me think. Well, Hollywood musicals were big then, like Showboat, and I'm trying to think some of the others were. But, big color musicals were a big deal. I think The Wizard of Oz, I was too little when that came out. I don't remember seeing that. But Bambi and Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, children went to kind of tame movies in those days. And then later on there were war movies, but I don't remember going to them too much. I think they were considered too violent. Mm-hmm. But the way the state was on Saturday and Sunday, there was 1 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 5 o'clock, and 7 o'clock. And there might have been a 9, but I'm not sure. And then during the week, I think it was just, there must have been a 9, because I think there were 2 shows on weeknights, like 7 and 9. And that's when, but we mostly went on the weekends, like on Saturday afternoon. Mm-hmm. Okay, can I get back to Falls?
Please.
Get back to the geographic part. Let me see if I can find that part. Well, the other area, I was just talking about the village, which was, the bank was a big thing there. The Falls Church Bank was on the corner. And so if you wanted anything, you pretty much went to the village, and I think, and I'm not sure about this, but at one time the library was located, when I was a child, next to the State Theater. I think maybe today it's a women's club or something, but I don't know. There was a wooden building, yes, white frame building, mm-hmm, there. So we would walk down there to the library, and if we wanted a special treat, we'd go to the 5 and 10, and we walked everywhere then, because especially during the war, there wasn't gas and we didn't have a car. People just didn't drive around. They either took the bus or walked pretty well everywhere they went. And then the other area of Falls Church was called East End, and that's now, I guess, called East Falls Church, but we called it West End and East End. And we went there some, but not nearly as often as we went to the village because there wasn't a whole lot there. I think there may have been a drugstore. I don't know at what point that was built, but there was a drugstore at the corner there of Washington Street and Fairfax Drive, I guess. Fairfax Drive was called that in Arlington, but when you crossed the line into Falls Church, then it became Lincoln Avenue. It was the same street. You didn't turn or anything, but it just changed names. So I think in that part of Falls Church, it was called Fairfax Drive. And there was a movie theater there, too, and it was called the Lee, L-E-E, and it was considered much lower than the State. The Lee was kind of crummy, you know, I mean, like there was popcorn on the floor, and it showed like second-run movies and westerns and that kind of thing. So you didn't go to the Lee for, unless, I don't know whether it was cheaper or why we would go to the Lee sometime. Oh, and it used to have the serials, you know, like maybe, I can't remember the man, whether it was Tom Mix or there was somebody that each Saturday you'd see another version of this movie, you know, thing. But East End just didn't have the same feel as the Village. It just wasn't as big a deal. The Village was, you know, the State and the drugstore and the 5 and 10. That was where you wanted to go. And then, well, there was one other area that I was mentioning to Peter that it was a school. It was kind of forbidding looking. And instead of having fire escapes outside, they had big tubes. So because these were somewhat handicapped people who lived there, I think they thought that they would just, if there was a fire, they'd shoot them down these metal tubes. So it was a big house, I mean, big house, and outside were all these tubes coming down from the second floor. So that was, we used to kind of walk on the other side of the street when we went down Broad Street because it was just kind of forbidding looking and scary looking. And then that was torn down and Tyler Gardens was built in its place. I think you told me it was it was torn down in the mid-40s, late 40s maybe.
I think that's right.
Somewhere around there.
Do you remember what kinds of things you would buy at the 5 and Dime store?
Well, probably toys, some kind, like, you know, a water gun or I don't remember. Oh, I used to have paper dolls a lot. Have you ever seen what they look like?
Is that the kind that you would cut out and
Yeah.
make like a...
No, it wouldn't be that strip thing. It was a book, like a coloring book.
Okay.
And it maybe would cost 25 cents. I don't remember exactly. But it was like a magazine, about the size of a magazine, and it would have kind of a hard, like a little bit thicker cover. But when you opened it up, the pages were just regular pages like this. You know, they were not heavy. And you took your scissors and you cut out all these clothes from the pages. And then, but the paper dolls themselves were firmer, like more, not cardboard, but a little bit, maybe they were the same material as the cover of the book was. And then you cut out all these clothes and hats and things, and then you played with them. And you would take your paper doll and say, okay, I mean, this was imaginary play. You would, the clothes had little paper tabs, like on the, up here, like, and maybe on the sleeve, and you would cut out your paper dolls, all the clothes, and you might have several different sets of them because you were anxious to buy, you know, new paper dolls. And then you just played with them, like, you know, I'm going to the store and, you know, this, and you had to be playing with usually somebody else who had their paper dolls. And girls kept dolls much later. You know, we were very unsophisticated. And I think I remember some teenage girls that lived across the street, and they may have been like 13 or 14, but they would come and play paper dolls with me. And, you know, today that would, no 13-year-old would be seen playing with little kids. But that was just the way it was then. And we would get I remember going, there was another drugstore, I think probably when I was a teenager, that was up in West Falls Church. I think it was called Wallace and Monroe. And they had another one over kind of near Annandale Road out that way, on 29, I guess it was. But anyhow, you would go and you could get a cone for a nickel. And if you were really rich, you'd get a double-decker that cost 10 cents. And then occasionally we'd get a milkshake maybe or something, but we didn't do great buying. I mean, your allowance might be 25 cents a week, so if you spent 20 of it on the movies, you didn't have much left over to buy things. But my mother would go to the Robinsons, I mean, it was, I guess I don't know what you could compare the 5 and 10 in those days. Like, it didn't sell food. It might have sold candy, but it mainly sold things like household, like it sold some clothes and aprons and socks and different things like that, and household things like pans or dishes, and sort of it wasn't a hardware store, but didn't have, I don't think, things like hammers or nails, but it had things that you would use in the house, kind of thing. So that was those two stores. And you go ahead.
Well, at a certain point, the Catholic War veterans and the veterans of the foreign wars decided to honor your brothers, Paul and Jack. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Okay. It didn't happen, as far as I remember, it didn't happen while the war was going on. It was a little bit later that the American Legion was there, but this was something new. I don't know whether it was the first time that Falls Church had a war veterans post, but that one was named Martin Leopard Sipes, and it was for my two brothers and these other two men from Falls Church that had died. And then a little bit later, I think that was the beginning of the Catholic War veterans. I don't think they were around until then. There weren't just that many people in Falls Church who would be Catholic and war veterans. So they formed, and that was called the Paul and Jack Martin Post of the Catholic War Veterans. And at some point, I think the date was in the 80s or 90s, 89, they dedicated 2 benches to my brothers. They paid for them to be installed along the W&OD trail, one in West Falls Church near Spring Street and the other at East End. Well, at that time, I don't know if you have pictures of it, East End had a train station, like along the tracks of the train, and that stayed there for a long time. I don't know whether it was ever used for some kind of community building or something, but that's where they put the bench, and we went to the dedication of that.
Could you talk a little bit about what you did after you graduated high school? You said you went to Mary Washington.
Yes,
did you ever,
that's right.
Did you continue living in the Falls Church area? Or?
Yeah, my parents did. I left for Mary Washington in September of '54 and went there for 4 years, majored in English. And my parents lived in Falls at 806 until my senior year. When I turned 21, they rented that house on Lincoln Avenue and moved to Tyler Gardens. And that's where I lived my senior year at college. And when I got married, I left there. And my parents later moved to a place on West Street, West and Ellison Street, and lived there. After I was married and had children, much later when my 5th child was born, I went to Catholic University Library School and got a degree after about 5 years from there, and worked. My first job after that was in Arlington County. And it was interesting, the woman who had been the director of the Falls Church Library when I worked there. Her name was Jane Nida, Nida. And after she left Falls Church and went to become the director in Arlington, so when I applied for a job in Arlington, I had a contact with her, having known me when I worked in Falls Church. And then when I lived in Fairfax at that time, and then later I moved to Wrightsville Beach, North Carolina, where my husband and I retired. And then we moved to, just recently, to Ashby Ponds Retirement Community in Ashburn, Virginia.
And so how do you feel when you return to Falls Church and you see all the changes?
Amazed. Just amazed, dumbfounded. Well, that's the other thing I meant to mention. We didn't have restaurants in Falls Church. They weren't around. I mean, there might have been one or two, but we never went. And so when I read in the Post and they're talking about, oh, you should try this restaurant, it's in Falls Church, and every time I read it, I think, where is it in Falls Church? All these ethnic restaurants and things, I'm like, whoa, this is really, really different. And where my mother and I used to go sometime, there were restaurants in this metro area called Hot Shops, and they were owned by the Marriott Corporation. And they were places that families went, or they weren't fast food. You went in and sat down, but they were simple food, milkshakes, hamburgers, that kind of thing. And so that's where we used to take the bus and go up. It was on the Falls Church side of Seven Corners, and that was before Seven Corners Shopping Center was built. I remember when that was built. So I keep going off on tangents, but anyhow,
That's quite all right.
that I am amazed. When I came the first time to see you a couple months ago, and I just kept looking at all these big buildings, where did these come from, and what used to be in that spot, because Broad Street had quite a few houses, single-family houses along it. And I was thinking about that the other day, at the intersection of Broad and Park, and then I'm not sure what the street was here, but it might have been Lee, I don't know, but it was before you got to the library, before it was along that stretch, there was a big baseball field there, and an empty, it was like a full block lot, and it must have been about the maybe 600 block of Broad Street, I'm not sure, but I don't know whether we used that when we were older at St. James, like 7th or 8th grade, as the ball, for baseball. But I can remember going to that field and watching people play baseball. So I don't know when it got changed. Something got built along that stretch when we were still living on Lincoln Avenue that was called the Co-op, and it was a grocery store. And I think that might have come in along that stretch where the ball field used to be.
We've got pictures of that grocery store in our collection, actually.
Yeah, and it was it was built in the 50s, I think, because my mother used to walk there and go to that.
Well, is there anything else you'd like to add that we haven't touched on?
Let's see. Well, since we're close to Halloween, I was going to talk a little about Halloween.
Sure.
It was before, I had neighbors that had a big family, and so they would go out. I don't know where they got this, but the night before Halloween, they called Beggar's Night. So we went out twice. We went out on Beggar's Night, and people were kind of surprised to see you because it wasn't Halloween. And then we went out on Halloween. And this same family, they were my playmates, and they had some older siblings, but they used to have this thing, and I don't know what day, I think it was once a month, that was called Trash Day or something like that. I mean, it wasn't your regular trash. It was like junk that you put out. And you put it out like on a certain Monday of the month. And this family liked to do trash hunting. So we would go out. I'm surprised that my mother didn't give up on it, but she was very lenient. I think by the time I was the 8th, she'd let me do whatever I wanted. But we would go around and look through the trash that was out on all the houses around the neighborhood, out at the street, and see if there was anything good that we could pick out of that and bring home. So there were a lot of odd things that we did, but except for the war being on, otherwise it was a pretty happy, carefree childhood. Oh, one more thing about the war that I forgot, and then you can shut me down. When we were notified of my brothers being killed, and I remember this very well, I think because it was so shocking, the way that they would tell you was that an army car, not a Jeep or something, but just like an olive green, ordinary looking car, would pull up in front of our house on Lincoln Avenue. And there weren't that many cars going up and down, so you would notice this car. And somebody in a uniform would get out and start walking up your sidewalk towards your front door. And after it happened a couple of times, I would just panic when I would see, because you didn't know what they were going to tell you. And I was counting one time, and I think it was 6 times that they came, because they would come if someone was wounded. And so I had, I don't know, Joe might have been wounded twice, but Paul was wounded once. And then they would come if somebody was missing. They didn't like come up to your door and say, your son was killed. They'd say, your son is missing in action. And then they would wait like, I don't know, a month or two, quite a bit of time, before this person was really declared dead, because they didn't know for sure. My brother that was killed at sea, they had no body. But my brother that was killed in France in '44, they did have a body, but I think they had to check dog tags and bury these people and everything. So all of those times, each one of those things happening, missing and then dead, this would happen. And so it got so that I hated to see, as I got older, when I was like 8, and my brother died in '44, and I saw this man coming up the walk, it was like, who is it going to be? And saying, let it just be somebody wounded. Don't let it be somebody killed. So those were traumatic events like that went through, and for my parents to see them, so sad and so, awful. And we had, you've heard of the flags, the gold stars, and
Yes.
you know what I mean about that? You hung this in your window, and it was about that big. It was cloth. And if you had somebody serving, you had a blue star stuck on it. And if someone was killed, then you had a gold star. So we had, and my sister's fiance was fighting in the Pacific. And so we had those stars on our cloth, on our little flag. And there's one picture of me that I'll show you sometime, but I'm standing on the front porch, and I'm like 8, and I have pigtails, and I'm holding this flag, and I look kind of sad. And one of my brothers, my brother Paul, wrote and said, I saw the picture of Kay with the flag, but don't look sad, I'll be home. And he never did, but I mean, there was a lot of that kind of thing. But my parents tried to protect me, when I'm 6, 7, 8 years old, from the worst of this. And my mother used to say that if I hadn't been there in the house and a small child, she would have gone to pieces. But she knew that she had to get up every morning and give me breakfast and get me ready for school. And so she had to be strong through that. But that was, for my parents. Now, when I'm an adult and look back on it, I know it was an awful time. But the other thing was that so many people in the neighborhood had a father, a brother, a son in the war, that you had this support of people who, it wasn't like an odd thing that just happened to one family. There was all over around you were people that were missing or, killed and gone away for a long time. So I can call it quits.
Well, thank you so much for speaking with
welcome.
us today.